You're listening to the Really Useful Podcast. This is the Tech Podcast for Technophobes. My name is Christian Cawley, and with me this week, I'm delighted to say, is Ian Buckley. Ian, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. It's really good to be back.
Absolutely. It's good to... I've done a few podcasts that have been solo affairs, and while it's kind of interesting to be able to do that on your own and sort of like find this kind of new way of working whereby you basically, I'm just talking to you, the listener, rather than talking to, say, Ian or Ben Stegner or James Frew or Megan Ellis or Gavin Phillips. It's really nice to have someone to talk to.
Yeah, I'm sure, yeah.
I've been going a bit doolally talking to myself.
I'm really impressed that you've even managed to do it. I can't quite imagine how I'd get through a podcast alone for exactly that reason. I think I'd probably just think I was going mad halfway through.
Yeah, I did consider just talking to a mirror, but then I thought that'd be a bit too like normal life. So no, I'm joking. Okay, so this week, as you'll guessed from the title of the show, we're looking at single board computers. Things like the Raspberry Pi, Arduino, all those things. There's a new computer come along, which isn't really a computer. It's a microcontroller, the Raspberry Pi Pico. Is it called Pico or Pico?
I've been calling it the Pico,
okay.
And I think it is Pico, but I guess it could be both, couldn't it?
I have a long history of mispronouncing things, so let's go.
So do I, yeah.
With what you say it is. This came along a few days ago. We're recording this at the beginning of, the second week of March 2021. It came along at the beginning of February. Now, I noticed the interesting thing about the Pico is that it's very low budget, and it came along in a similar way, strapped to the front of a magazine, as the Raspberry Pi Zero did a few years ago.
It did, which was a very interesting thing. I know it's a very cheap board, but there's a part of me that is kind of giddy at the idea of actually getting something so useful on the front of a magazine. It's a very childlike kind of glee to it, you know?
My kids get Lego on the front of magazines, which when I was a kid, I would have thought that was absolutely amazing. But on the flip side is, when I was a kid, you used to get games on the front of magazines, not actual computers. So, it all balances out, doesn't it? So, now, I think one of the main things about this week's show is that the Pico is a Raspberry Pi, but it's not a Raspberry Pi. It's a microcontroller, which
it is. Yeah.
That lines it closer to something like the Arduino Nano, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I feel like since the release of the Pico, it's one of the things that a few people still haven't quite got their head around, because a lot of people who are familiar with everyday computing like the Raspberry Pi because it is a very small form factor hobby computer. It has an operating system. And for a lot of people, it's their first introduction to working with a Linux system. And Raspberry Pi is kind of synonymous with that. They're very education focused. And yeah, it is essentially, the Raspberry Pi Zero, which isn't much bigger than the Raspberry Pi Pico, is a full Linux computer. Whereas, as you say, the Pico is a microcontroller, and these are a little bit different. Whereas a Raspberry Pi is a computer, a microcontroller is more like the kind of thing that you find in all of the devices around you. It doesn't so much have an operating system. There's no way you can type commands into. There's no file system as such. They're little chips that are designed for very specific tasks. And a really good example of what one of those might be is if you have, say, a microwave with a little touch panel on it, and you type in how long you want it to cook and how hot, it's a microcontroller that will take that information and actually give it to the innards of the microwave to do that task for you and take care of all the timing. Microcontrollers are great, actually. They're a really interesting way of getting into coding actual hardware, actual electronics that will do things without having to learn a lot of electrical engineering, which can be quite a dense topic.
So I would imagine, based on what you've told me and based on programming it, that programming a device, well, I mean, I know that if I program on an Arduino, I use a piece of software on my computer, then I upload the information, the program, to the Arduino. And it's the same with the Pico, is it?
It is almost identical in that with Arduino, if you've used the Arduino IDE, and for those of you that aren't familiar, the Arduino IDE is a piece of software on the computer which is designed to be, you type code into it and then you press a button and it will take care of moving the code from your computer onto the microcontroller itself. You do exactly the same thing with the Raspberry Pi Pico. One of the slight differences is it also has this thing called MicroPython, which is a version of the Python programming language, which means that you can run Python code directly on the Pico, but again, you can run some Python commands, but you can't, say, type ls and see a file system. You can't open files and close files. It's not quite the same as using a normal computer.
I actually got something just on that whole topic. I got a piece of a Kickstarter thing called the Extron Pro, which arrived a few days ago, and that is a very small computer, very, very small computer. It's about sort of, I'm just getting it out now. Well, it's not computer, it's kind of computer handheld. It's almost palm-sized console with an 1.5 by 1.5 display that is magnetic and can be removed. And it's got a D-pad and A/B buttons, and it can be programmed with Python, Java, and the Microsoft blocks code thing.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm just having a look at it now. It's a very interesting little device. I'd never heard of it before.
Yeah, I stumbled upon it whilst looking for retro gaming things on Kickstarter. It's not really retro. It's more in the retro style. It's got a massive 16 megabytes RAM. It's a lovely little thing, though. It's very cool, nice little games on it, and I'm going to be reviewing it for Make Use Of. So there is a fair bit of creating and then uploading with that. Obviously on a completely different scale. But so microcontrollers, there are more than just the Pico and the Arduino, isn't there? We've had things like Teensy, and there's the ESP32 and other things with ESP32 on it.
There is, yeah. The thing about microcontrollers in general is that, the perfect example actually is the Extron that you just mentioned, because having a quick look at the Kickstarter page, I see that the microcontroller that they are using is called an STM32. Mm-hmm. Now, these are a really well-known microcontroller. There's hundreds of variations of them. And actually, if you can just buy one of those chips for very, very cheap, and you can make your own circuit board and program it. But it's a very complex process, and there are people who train for a very long time to do that. It's a career. And the STM32 is one of the most famous ones. And as you mentioned, the ESP32 is very popular because, as well as being able to do the exact same process we talked about before, you write code, and then that code lives on the chip, and it will do tasks for you. The ESP32 also has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built in, which of course is very handy for Internet of Things devices. And in fact, most of the connected devices that you have, like smart home devices around the house, will have some variation, if not that exact chip, something which is a microcontroller with a wireless unit on it for connecting to it. Even Arduinos, we're very used to calling an Arduino a microcontroller, but actually they all have their own different chips on them too. So the Arduino Uno, which is probably the most well-known hobby microcontroller, has an 80 mega 328P chip on it, which, again, you can, and in fact, I have a bag of them sitting across the room from me, and you can program them completely separately from Arduino, but it is a much more involved process that requires a bit more learning and research to do.
When you say bag, how many are you talking about?
I got a bag of 20 of them off eBay, and it really wasn't very expensive. I think it was only about 10 or 15 euros, so yeah, it's quite cheap.
Excellent. So I suppose in a way we're progressing through this week's really useful podcast in a kind of progression of size, because we're going to talk next about the Raspberry Pi.
Yes.
This is a computer, but it's small. It's the size of a credit card, or in the case of the Pi Zero, half a credit card. And it runs Linux, as you say, and there's a whole crazy number of things that you can do with a Raspberry Pi. Now, you mentioned people using Linux for the first time. Now, I had some smatterings of Linux. All of my knowledge of Linux comes from using a Raspberry Pi, on the whole.
Yeah, same for me for the most part. I think I had installed Linux a few times just to sort of see what it was like.
Sure, yeah.
But at that stage, I very much just wanted something that was like Windows, and I didn't really delve under the hood at all. And one of the things about the Raspberry Pi is, as well, it does have a normal desktop. You can get a Raspberry Pi, plug a monitor and a keyboard into it, and use it just like a regular computer. But another thing you can do is run it in what is known as Headless Mode, which is what a lot of people do. And then you're more likely to just use a terminal on a different computer to talk to it over the network.
Yeah.
And then you're just typing text. You're just in the terminal, which is where a lot of people who use Linux spend most of their time, because it's a very powerful tool. And yeah, the Raspberry Pi taught me pretty much everything I know, or at least it was the beginning of my education in using the Linux terminal long before I used Linux kind of on a daily basis. And it is fantastic for that because it is a normal Linux system. It's running on slightly different hardware than your big desktop computer, but it works exactly the same. And yeah, you can, even the cheapest Raspberry Pi you can get, be it the Pi Zero or one of the cheaper full-size Raspberry Pis, can teach you everything you need to know about not just a Linux computer, but how to do networking, for example, on Linux. And it's a great way to learn programming as well. They really are kind of worth the hype, as it were. They're really fantastic little things.
They are very cool, and they do so much. And whilst they don't necessarily do them powerfully, it's not like you can install Cyberpunk 2077 on a Raspberry Pi. You could install it on a different system and then stream it to your Raspberry Pi and play it that way. I'm just checking something here. You mentioned a bag of 20 microcontrollers. I am the owner of, I'm just double checking here, I've got 2 of those, 14 Raspberry Pis.
Wow, that's
I have.
I thought I had a lot.
Yeah, that's the ones that I'm kind of purpose for. I've kind of logged them. So one of them's decommissioned. The original Pi B is decommissioned because it just doesn't seem to work very well anymore. And then others have had various projects over the years. So I've got a B, a B plus, a 2, 4 zeros, including 1 0W, 2 threes, a 3B plus, then a 3 in the Piper, which is a wooden Raspberry Pi kit for kids, a Raspberry, and I'm looking at this and wondering if there's actually one missing. There's a Raspberry Pi 4 4GB, a Raspberry Pi 4 8GB, and a Raspberry Pi 400 as well. Now, the interesting thing about that list is, that guy off a really useful podcast is bragging about how many Raspberry Pis he's got. But I'm actually, aside from the A models, which I don't have any of, and I don't have any Raspberry Pi computes either. That's kind of a evolution of the Raspberry Pi that I've just presented to you there. It's gone from a credit card size board through the various iterations, each version upgrading the connectivity, whether physical with faster Ethernet, more USB, going to USB 3.0, upgraded inputs and outputs of other types, extending the size of the GPIO from 26 to 40 pins, increasing the amount of RAM, increasing the processor speed, replace faster processors, physical faster processors. Everything in the system on the chip has been improved through various iterations, and it can now do better graphics. Its evolution is the fact that it's still the same size, and there's not that much compatibility for cases from the old models to the more recent models, but that it's now built into a keyboard as the Raspberry Pi 400. It's kind of a fascinating evolution, isn't it? That it's gone from out-and-out sort of hobbyist board to more or less a desktop computer, whether or not you're using it in that kind of 1980s style computer and a keyboard, or you're placing it in one of the increasing number of small form factor desktop cases.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, one of the things about that is quite interesting is that the evolution of it. It sounds like a strange thing, but the evolution of Raspberry Pi cases is a very good a very good marker for what has happened to Raspberry Pi in general. Because at first, when you had a Raspberry Pi from a few years ago, let's say, a lot of the first enclosures were more or less just 2 pieces of acrylic with some standoff posts in between, just to stop dust falling on it and to stop you accidentally dropping anything metal on it and causing an electrical short. Whereas now, there are many cases, especially for the newer Raspberry Pi 4s, which are getting to the point that they could be described as quite powerful small computers. They really have improved that much. And yeah, some of the cases you can get for them now are like miniature desktop cases with cooling and with all of that kind of stuff built in that you can add extra hard drives to. In fact, you reviewed one of the nicer ones for Make Use of, I believe, didn't you? It's an aluminium bodied one. I forget the name of it.
This was the Desk Pi Pro. Yeah, I was impressed with that because although it did have some shortcomings. It has M2, but it's only got B key M2. So if you haven't got the right type of M2 SSD, which I didn't, then you can't use that. But the space for a hard drive or an SSD with SATA connectivity, the thing itself is just it's cold to the touch. It's freezing cold to touch it. The whole device is a heatsink aspect to it. It's fantastic for cooling. And but it just sits there, and it's weighty as well. A lot of the older cases that you mentioned, the two pieces of acrylic or 3D printed plastic or molded plastic, whatever, once you plug an Ethernet cable in or an HDMI cable in, which is kind of important as well, they're heavier than the case. They're heavier than the Raspberry Pi, and the Raspberry Pi is kind of at the mercy of where that cable wants to go. But with a case like this, like the Desk Pi Pro or the various similar cases, that's where the weight is, and no wire is going to be moving your Raspberry Pi around, which it's always been a frustration of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with all kind of smaller form factor boards like that, Raspberry Pi is a great example of one of them. And again, going back to talking about microcontrollers, it sounds like a very small thing, but as someone who spent many years fiddling with different kinds of microcontrollers, one of the bigger frustrations is that, especially if you're using a laptop, you practically need to tape the cable to the microcontroller down to the table, or it's just going to flip around in whatever direction it wants, including into cups of tea. That's happened to me a couple of times. I've lost microcontrollers to tea more than once in my life. As I said, it sounds like a very strange thing to say, but the evolution of things like Raspberry Pi cases and the logical kind of conclusion of that, which is the Raspberry Pi Foundation releasing the Pi 400, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a Raspberry Pi. It's just on a slightly different layout of PCB, and that is inside a keyboard. And not only does it look like just a wireless or a kind of a small keyboard in and of itself with no extra things, it's actually exactly the same size as the official Raspberry Pi keyboard that they sell that doesn't have a computer in. They managed to fit it all into an actual keyboard. Out of all of them, the Pi 400 is really the one that I just find to be quite impressive, really, because you can get this thing it's a fully usable computer. You could plug it into a telly. You know, if you don't even need to get people to set up a monitor on the desk or anything, it's just ready to go computer for not that expensive.
It's nice as well. It's nice and easy, and it feels. I mean, I'm speaking from a purely nostalgic sense, I suppose, but it feels like just the way computing is supposed to be. It's just, the keyboard, the computer's inside the keyboard. You connect it to the TV and you just start typing the way it was back in the day. And I know that's not the same for everybody, because people grew up in the 90s with PCs and games consoles, and things changed, and some people even had Macs. But, it's different to everyone. But given that the Raspberry Pi is a British computer and the ZX Spectrum was a major part of British computing, there are similarities there, and the Commodore 64 was huge in the UK as well, and again, key similarities there. So yeah, it just feels that it just has that comfort of being a computer that you just unpack and use without worrying about, I don't know, dust getting in the fan, or whether or not you're putting the disc in the right way up or whatever.
For sure, yeah. It has all of those hallmarks of kind of retro computing, but in terms of what you can actually do with it, it's right up there with a fully featured modern desktop or laptop. And of course, there's the other side to it as well, which I think is maybe one of the reasons why people do find a little bit of confusion between things like Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and the differences between them, which is one of the things that makes Raspberry Pis unique, is as well as being an all-in-one computer, it does have those 40 breakout pins, which means that while there are ways to attach electronics to your normal desktop computer, it isn't trivial. It's something you have to think quite carefully about. Whereas there are abundant kits, which again are really not all that expensive, which will allow you to have a whole range of different electronics, or even fully fledged little robot cars and things, which are either speaking to the Pi through wires to the GPIO pins or completely wireless. And it kind of feeds back into this idea of you could get this tiny, cheap computer, and whether you just want to use it a bit like a desktop, or whether you want to use it as some kind of media player or learn about Linux, on the one side you can do that. But with a few cheap electrical components, you could really get a head start in learning about things like robotics and hobby electronics, all using the same device. And again, that also stands for the Pi 400, because while it is in a keyboard, the back of that keyboard exposes those pins, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
You could plug an LED strip into the back, a very cheap LED strip, and then spend a little bit of time looking at code online and things like that, and learn how to program LED strips. You could more or less make a completely DIY home automated setup using one, without having to spend a huge amount on electronics, without having to do a university course, without having to do all of the things that just a short few years ago you would have to do to really get into it.
There is along with everything else we talk about on this week's really useful podcast, there is a link in the show notes to a collection of projects that you can do with the Raspberry Pi. It is a guide that is bursting at the seams. It needs to be far longer than it is, and it was too long when I wrote it, and then it's just gone even crazier since then. But that will be in the show notes. And we'll take a moment from our usual podcast proceedings to just remind you that the Really Useful Podcast can be found pretty much anywhere you find podcasts. So we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, we're on Google Podcasts. We're hosted at transistor.fm, so you can find us there as well. We're also on YouTube and, of course, on makeuseof.com. Now, however you subscribe to the Really Useful Podcast and listen to us, it would be amazing if you could take a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That will help us to find new listeners and take our podcast to ever greater heights. You'll find the link to our Apple Podcast page in the show notes. Thanks a lot. But moving on from the Raspberry Pi, because there are other devices that are Pi-like that aren't Pis. There's the Pi 64, and there's the Banana Pi, and there's all these clones and clones that aren't really clones, enhanced clones, and kind of. I'm losing my thread slightly there, but what I'm trying to say is there's devices that are like the Raspberry Pi that are kind of physically superior, which I'm getting away from. I think I keep, every time I go into mentioning the word clone, I do slowly start to veer towards Star Wars, and I think I'm doing it again there. But they have this kind of superior hardware, but at the same time they don't tend, and they've been around nearly as long as Raspberry Pi, but they don't tend to build up that momentum that the Pis had, do they? They don't have that same level of community around them, but they're still good devices in their own right.
Well, absolutely. That's one of the things, because Raspberry Pis, I guess one of the things we haven't implicitly mentioned so far is one of the things about them that is very desirable is their price. If I remember correctly, the most expensive standard Raspberry Pi board now is only $75, and you can get one for $30. They're very cheap. The Raspberry Pi Zero is, depending on availability, is kind of between 5 and 10 euros. It's a cheap board. You can get boards which are technically better in terms of hardware than the Raspberry Pi, about the same size, which are a bit cheaper. And the Banana Pi is a good example of that. They, for a lot of years, the clue's in the name. The Banana Pi was meant to be a very almost straight copy of the Raspberry Pi. But Pi has, and in fact, one of the things that's almost more impressive than the hardware is just this huge community of people who are passionate about education and want to make it easy for people to learn. And whether that is, again, learning the Linux side of things and using it as a computer, or learning electronics, or even just installing some cool media streaming software in there so you can make your own sort of version of a set-top box. Not really, not quite that, because you're not getting signals. More like a digital DVD player, let's call it that, I suppose. This support is out there because so many people adopted it. Whereas you get boards like the Banana Pi, which are... I have a Banana Pi, and it's, once you get it up and running, it's quite easy to use. But whereas with Raspberry Pi, anyone could follow the Getting Started guide on their website and get it up and running very quickly. With my first one, even though I'm not a complete novice, it took me a little while to even get my head around how to get things up and running. The documentation wasn't fantastic, and not all of it was in English, which didn't help. But that's what you said before is sort of interesting, that these boards, which are sort of clones, a lot of them I try to bring something slightly new to the table, try and have the edge over the Raspberry Pi. And if you are already someone who's quite familiar with Linux and doesn't mind getting in the weeds a bit, you can get a lot out of some of the newer boards, because some of them have artificial intelligence accelerators on them. Some of them have built-in eMMC storage on the board, so you don't even need to bother with a micro SD card once you've installed an operating system. They're all definitely worth looking into. But yeah, I feel it'll be a very long time until there's a single board computer which is as open to beginners as the Raspberry Pi is, just because they've had years of making it so.
Cool. Okay. I'll best hit this number here. Because usually I do that a few times in the episode and I've forgotten to. I suppose, and we've covered microcontrollers, we've covered Raspberry Pis and the clones, and we've mentioned Arduino and Raspberry Pi Pico, and I feel that we're coming towards the conclusion of our conversation in this week's really useful podcast. I suppose the most important thing, we've established that small microcontrollers are for very specific tasks, whereas a Raspberry Pi and similar devices are more like a desktop computer, but obviously a lot smaller with more modest hardware, can handle kind of multitasking and various programming projects, as well as sort of media and streaming and gaming to various degrees. I also mentioned, so a little bit of fun, I mentioned that there's an article with a lot of Raspberry Pi projects in it, but Ian, what is your personal favourite Raspberry Pi project?
Oh, that's a really good question. I know it might almost sound a little bit boring, but one of the things that I have a Raspberry Pi permanently set up, and it's over in the corner next to my router, and in fact, this sort of ties very nicely into the episode. I have a Raspberry Pi which is actually set up with a little ESP8266 board, which is similar to the ESP32 we were talking about before. It's a microcontroller with wireless connectivity to it, and what that Raspberry Pi does is it sits and it's just off. It's just sleeping. And then whenever I send a document to print, or whenever I want to get something from my NAS, because my NAS, my network assisted storage, I don't own a NAS box. I just have an old hard drive which is attached to the Raspberry Pi, because you can use it as that as well.
Yeah.
It's quite easy to set up. Whenever I want any of those things, the ESP32 actually wakes the Raspberry Pi up. It turns on, and then it will either send something to my printer, or it will, send a file or save a file, which is probably slightly overkill. But I'm one of those people that I know I could probably make that more efficient, and I could have just bought myself a cheap NAS. But I thought, why not make it myself? So that's my personal favorite project, just because it's something that I kind of built from the ground up. But there are so many out there. I remember going to an art kind of expo here in Berlin not long after I moved here several years ago, and one of the things that people had set up was a Raspberry Pi and a projector screen and some audio cues, and they were projecting onto the ceiling of an old barn, and you could see the live positions of a bunch of satellites they were tracking. And
wow.
Each one of which they were feeding all of that data into the Raspberry Pi and using it to produce live music using software synthesizers on the Raspberry Pi. So you could hear the satellites.
Wow.
And that is something that stuck with me. I've always thought that was a really beautiful and artful implementation, and a great way to show off what the Raspberry Pi is capable of.
That is really cool. I really like the sound of that. It actually reminds me, there's another device that we might have maybe spent a moment talking about, the BBC Microbit, which is another small microcontroller with various components that you can add to it. And I noticed, I thought it kind of died off, but I noticed that there's some new hardware being released for that recently. So I'll try and get some link for that in the show notes as well. I do like space-based Raspberry Pi projects. When I first got hold of Raspberry Pi, the first kind of hardcore sounds way beyond what it really was, which was getting an old printer and making it networked, which these days all the printers networked. I had an old HP LaserJet 1200, I think it was, or 2300, something like that, which wasn't networked, so I used Raspberry Pi, plug the USB into the Raspberry Pi, then network cable into the Raspberry Pi to my router, and I had a networked printer all of a sudden. And I thought that was absolutely amazing that I just had the tools to be able to do that straight away, rather than spending 80, 90 quid on eBay to get the networking. It wasn't even a dongle. It's on a networking module that plugged into the back of the printer, which was kind of half the size of the printer itself. But personally speaking, my favorite use of the Raspberry Pi that I've used it for was to basically set up a clone of a website that I own in order to do development work.
Yeah, they really, for anything networking and anything web development, Raspberry Pis can be fantastic because um, when you're, at its most basic, networking and websites are talking to computers, be them on a local network or on the internet. And when you're on the internet, you are just talking to other computers in server rooms, wherever. And yeah, you can have your own test server just sitting on your desk, i.e. a Raspberry Pi. And a lot of the new tools that people are using, like Docker and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Kubernetes.
That's how I say it.
Microsoft's
both
clustering thing. You can set up environments for learning and developing on just a Raspberry Pi. For doing that, and there's a lot of great YouTube tutorials out about that. And yeah, the power of being able to learn networking with just an outlay of between $30 and $70 for everything you need to get going with it it's just incredible when you compare it to the hoops you would have to jump through to do that on a budget in the past.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned space projects before. One of the early Raspberry Pi projects I saw, I think a lot of people saw, was attaching it to a weather balloon and a camera and some mobile phone GPS system, and then launching it into space and then watching it come down and filming and finding it. And I thought that whole idea of being able to run your own space program for sort of estimated, £100, that's amazing. Yeah. But I've also seen a use where the Raspberry Pi was attached to a telescope, and then it was doing time-lapse photography during the night. I live in a part of the world which is kind of surrounded by industry, so I don't see much of the night sky, unfortunately. I also live in a part of the world where I should be able to see the aurora borealis, but thanks to cloud cover and bright lights from industry, I've still never seen it.
Yeah. Yeah, I very much in the same boat, really. Where I grew up, which is just a short shot north from where you are, was exactly the same situation. I had the bright lights in Newcastle obscuring all of that.
Frustrating. Yeah, so I think things like that are really cool with the Raspberry Pi. It is so thanks to Linux and thanks to the GPIO and a couple of other components on there. The camera input, for instance, there is so much that you can do then. So you can develop in software and applications for personal use. There's one that I saw that would convert cine into digital. And obviously that's it's probably a lot easier than to just send your cine film away to get converted. But these guys got together and made a timer that pushed the cine film around frame by frame, photographed it with a digital camera, converted it later on. Fantastic use. And just the projects that it opens up, the Raspberry Pi, is it's just a mind-blowing library of amazing projects that it has.
It is mind-blowing, and one of the things about it that I think makes it so inspiring is that, as mentioned before, they are quite cheap, so that if you did buy one just for a specific project, you wouldn't feel like you were it would feel bad to buy a very expensive computer just to stick it inside a box to only do one thing, whereas when you are spending a little bit less, it doesn't feel like quite so much of an outlay, and it can bring life to things that just do not work anymore. I mean, a perfect example of this is something I did some years ago for a friend who had a very beautiful old cabinet, I believe it was a Roberts radio, which used to be a working wireless, which was given to them by their grandfather. But it did not work at all. And while they could have maybe taken it to someone who was able to do vintage electronics repair, I'm certainly not that person. I couldn't do that. But what I was able to do, without damaging the insides of it particularly, was stick a Raspberry Pi in there and hook it up to the internal speaker using a little board I got off eBay. Again, that cost me about $5, meaning that this old radio that didn't work anymore, now they could turn it on, go on their phone, and then play whatever. I mean, at the time it wasn't Spotify, but they could play whatever music they had on their phone through this old radio. And the Raspberry Pi just sits in there perfectly happy. And because the Pi cost only 30 quid, it didn't really, £30, sorry, it didn't really, it didn't feel like a huge outlay. And they had this beautiful old radio that was working again. And that's one of the many things that this board is kind of really special for.
Yeah.
It's small, it's extendable, and it's cheap.
Absolutely. So I'm going to hit this again. Oh shit, wrong one. So, oh, going well tonight. So I'm going to hit this one again, which nicely brings us to the end of this single board computer really useful podcast special from makeuseof.com. Everything we've discussed this week will be in the show notes. As mentioned earlier on, which Ian won't have heard, there are various ways that you can follow us, and please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and all the show notes can be found on Make Use Of and anywhere else you can find the podcast, basically. Oh, God, I fucked this up. It's getting late. I'll work something. I'll work something out. So, from myself, Christian Cawley, and from Ian Buckley, it's goodbye until next time.